My name is Nolan Kaczynski.
I'm Jacob Rubleski.
I'm Jonathan Kaur, and we're interviewing Bob Buege on November 10th, 2017 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Marquette University High School, and our videographer is Tommy Landowski.
Thanks again for being here today. It's very, very nice. We'd like to learn more about the Milwaukee Braves and the history involved. My first question is, what sparked your interest in baseball, and can you tell us about how you originally got involved in baseball?
I got interested in professional baseball when I was 7. This was in 1953. The Braves had recently moved from Boston to Milwaukee. My dad and I went to a doubleheader on the 5th of July, 1953. And everything about it just was interesting to me. The look of the field. I had never seen such green grass. A lot of people comment on that sort of thing. I was intrigued by the names of the players. Names like Rip Rapolsky, Peanuts Lowry. A lot of these guys had nicknames, and they would announce them that way. And I was just interested in the whole scene. It was a sellout crowd. It was a doubleheader on a Sunday against the St. Louis Cardinals. The nearest visiting ball player to where I was seated was Stan Musial, who was one of the all-time greats. Now, I didn't know that at the time. My dad told me, watch this guy, he's really good. Well, I was disappointed because he didn't hit a home run, but he was pretty good. Warren Spahn was the pitcher. Warren Spahn had a high leg kick. If you've never seen it, it's unbelievable how high he would kick his leg before delivering a pitch, and I found that interesting. One other thing that I saw, which I never saw again, was that between innings, as the players would come off and go to the dugout for their turn to bat, they would often just toss their gloves on the ground and leave them there. And then they'd pick them up when they ran out to their position for the next inning. That was abolished in 1953. But that really struck me. The first home run that I saw hit the foul pole and dropped down. Well, that was a home run. But I didn't know that, and I couldn't understand why the outfielder wasn't running to get it. He walked over and picked it up and very casually threw it in. Anyway, all these little details just captured my imagination, really. The other thing I recall very vividly was the smell. It seemed like every man in the stands was smoking a cigar. Everybody did in those days. And I've always associated that smell with baseball. Anyway, it was just a whole series of really interesting little things, and I started following baseball.
Who did you attend that first game with? Was it just your folks?
I was just with my dad.
Why was the glove rule abolished?
I really don't know. I didn't know for many years that there was such a rule. I suppose because there was always the possibility that somebody would trip over it or the ball would hit it. But in all the research I've done in baseball, which is thousands of hours, I've never come across any reference to the ball hitting the glove or somebody tripping over it. I have seen some old film of players that did that left them on the field, but I don't know why they did away with it.
What was your favorite player when you grew up watching the Braves?
Well, I had two. They were the biggest stars. The first one was probably Warren Spahn. Warren Spahn was the pitcher I just mentioned with the high leg kick, and he was the most outstanding of the ball players that came from Boston and became the Milwaukee Braves. Everybody in baseball respected him. He was a perennial 20-game winner. The only concern was that he was so old. He was 32, and people figured he was on his last legs. 12 years later, he was still pitching for the Braves, but anyway, he was one of them. Spahn is in the Hall of Fame, deservedly so. He won more games than any left-handed pitcher ever, and no one will ever get close to his record. The other player that I fell in love with that first game was Eddie Matthews. Eddie Matthews also is in the Hall of Fame. Eddie, in the first game that I saw, he hit a home run that, according to the newspapers, was 472 feet. Just crushed it. And so he was my other hero right away. So those two guys. But the thing that was different was that the city was so crazy about the Braves that everybody who played on the team was a hero. So Jim Pendleton, who didn't play very much, was as much of a hero as Spahn, or other guys gradually became better known, but anybody in a Braves uniform was Milwaukee's hero.
Most of the games today, people drive to the game, and it's the big parking lots and whatnot. But back then, the modes of transportation were different. How did you get to the games when you went in the 50s?
Most people drove to the games just as they do now. There were buses, maybe a few more buses, but most people arrived by car. And they had parking for something like 11,000 cars, which was the biggest in the major leagues. Most ballparks were built in a much earlier era when there weren't as many people driving to the games. In Borchert Field, for example, the minor league park in Milwaukee, they didn't build in any parking spaces at all. But that was because there were no cars. That was 1888. But in the era of the Braves, most people drove their cars. Parking was a quarter, and it stayed at that for years.
You talked about the parking of County Stadium. Were there any, or can you describe interesting features about County Stadium?
Interesting features. Well, one of the things was that when it was built, there were no center field bleachers. There was nothing in center field. There was a fence, and then it looked out over the parking lot. And in an afternoon game, most games were played in the daytime at that time. If it was a sunny day, you'd get a reflection off the windshields of the cars. So the batters couldn't see the ball. They couldn't pick up the ball from the background. That's why almost every park now has some kind of dark background in center field so the guys can pick up the ball. In those days, it was really tough. So the second year that the Braves were in town, they planted some trees out in center field, just beyond the center field fence, to block off that sun shining off the cars. So it helped a little bit, but it was always a tough park for hitting.
When you went to the games at County Field, can you describe where in the grandstands you sat and what you could see from your vantage point?
Well, we sat all over the place. The first game that I attended, we sat in the bleachers in left field. One thing that was different, the Braves were such a sensation that it was hard to get tickets. It was a big deal. It's like getting tickets for the Super Bowl. It was a big deal just to have that ticket. So you took what you could get. The bleacher tickets went on sale the day of the game. So people would get there early and line up. And so that's where we sat that first doubleheader that I attended. But otherwise, we sat all over. I don't think we ever sat in the upper deck. One of the features of the ballpark was that in the upper deck, because it had been built for the minor league Brewers and not for the Braves, there were no seats. They had benches, like bleachers, and they did that for the first season. But other than that, we sat wherever we could get tickets, really.
You mentioned getting to the game early and getting tickets. Can you describe the typical game day from getting tickets to leaving the stadium?
Well, people got there very early, partially to get a good parking place, also partially to see infield practice, which ball clubs don't even do anymore. They used to have infield practice, and a lot of fans like to watch that. I always did. So people would get there early. They might get there 2 hours before the game and go to their seats and watch infield practice. One thing that was very different was that there was no tailgating. I don't remember exactly when tailgating started, but it was probably mid to late 50s. And even then, there were only a handful of people who did that. Now, of course, that's a big part of the attraction of the game, going there to socialize and have a few beers and so forth. Anyway, that's quite different now.
Were the better seats in County Stadium more expensive than the standing?
Well, they were, yeah. The bleacher tickets, as I recall, were 60 cents each. Now, you have to account for inflation and all that. So, I mean, it wasn't as cheap as it sounds, but I think they were 60 cents. And they also had children's prices. So, depending on who bought the seat, if it were a child, it was only about 75 cents. And it might cost twice that for an adult. Now, of course, everybody pays the same because they can make more money. But the highest priced seats were in the mezzanine, which is kind of like the press box would be, and it's stretched around the bottom of the upper deck. And those were probably close to $3, which was a lot at that time. And then, depending on where you were, the grandstand might be $1.25, maybe a little more in the upper deck than the lower deck. Other than that, not too much different.
Could you tell us about a few instances that you met notable Braves players?
Well, at the time, I didn't meet any of them. They were, well, I shouldn't say that. Once in a while, we would hang around and try to get autographs. And the players were usually quite accommodating at that time with autographs. It was just, they considered it part of their job. But in general, I didn't know the ball players. Now, since then, I've gotten to know quite a few players. For example, Johnny Logan was one of my heroes when I was a kid. And he played for the Braves from 1953 to 1961 and then was traded to Pittsburgh. Well, I never expected to know Johnny, but later on, much later, I got to know him very well through the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association. He was the president, and I'm currently the president. He died about 3 years ago. So I got to meet quite a few of the guys. I wrote a couple books about the Milwaukee Braves, and as a result of that, I interviewed a lot of guys and got to know them. I got to know Eddie Matthews. I went out to his house in San Diego, and we did 3 days of interviews, and that was in preparation for me writing a book about him. So in recent years, I've met a lot of them, but not at the time.
Can you describe what it's like or what's going through your head when you're meeting these childhood heroes?
Well, it's not as big a deal. I mean, you realize that when you were a kid, you were starstruck. It's like meeting a movie star or something. And they're very different when you're on an equal level with them. You know, they're older than me, but not all that much. And they're just ordinary people that happen to have a little skill in baseball. Mostly very nice people.
So as a career, you're a teacher and a writer. What inspired you to theme your writing around baseball?
Well, it's a long story. You going anywhere? In 1985, there was an event at the Eagles Club right up the street called Pizza Jamboree or something to do with pizza. And I guess you could go there and get samples of pizza. Well, I was not interested in that. But to get more people to come to it, they had Warren Spahn there signing autographs. So I hadn't seen him since he had pitched. And I thought it might be interesting, so I went. So I was in line with all these little kids waiting for our autographs, and most of them didn't know who he was. They were there with their dad, and they just stood in line and had this old man sign their books, whatever they had. So as a result of that, I wrote an article about Warren Spahn and about different ways in which our lives had intersected. So where I was when he pitched a certain game and that sort of thing. And I sold it to Milwaukee Magazine. And in doing that article, I was trying to fact check about a game that was played in 1963 in San Francisco. It was a 16-inning game. Warren Spahn pitched the whole game. He was 42 years old at the time. And the other pitcher was Juan Marichal, who is now in the Hall of Fame. He pitched the whole game. So Spahn threw 201 pitches. If you compare it to today, it's just unbelievable. But that particular game was one that stood out in my memory and that I had written about in the article. And I wanted to double check my facts. And I went to the library to look on microfilm of the newspaper, but I couldn't find the game. And I looked and finally realized I was looking in the wrong year. It was in 63 and I was looking at 62. So I was reminded at that point that people's memories are terrible, including my own. And nobody had ever written a book about the Milwaukee Braves where I could look it up. So I decided to just expand my research from that article. And I wrote a book, 1988, called The Milwaukee Braves, A Baseball Eulogy. So that's how I got started writing about baseball. And since then I've written, I don't know, dozens, maybe a couple hundred articles about the Braves. And I wrote a book also about Eddie Matthews. So that's my career.
Can you describe the atmosphere at County Stadium during a typical Braves game?
Well, the atmosphere was smoke from those cigars, quite literally the atmosphere. And it still has a certain odor to it. Ballparks, the smell of brats and popcorn and kettle corn, that was the one that always was really a strong smell at Miller Park. I remember when it caught fire one day, and then you had the smell of burning kettle corn. In the 50s, it was a big event. People went to the games because they liked the games, but also because it was a status symbol. We've got a new team, we're in the major leagues, and if you look at pictures from that era, all the men wore suits. They wouldn't think of going to a ball game without wearing a suit. And the women, they dressed like they would on Easter or something. So it was all baseball. Like I said, there was no tailgating. There was, they didn't have gimmicks like they do now. They have areas for kids at Miller Park. They can climb on things, and there are all different kinds of activities you can take part in without even watching the game. But in the 50s, you were there to watch the game. It was a much more business-like atmosphere, but very excited too. In 1953, some out-of-town writer, I don't know which one, wrote in a column that County Stadium was like an insane asylum with bases, and that was a much quoted line. And it was. People got really excited. If somebody hit a foul ball, they'd all cheer and go crazy. It was like a little kid discovering things on Christmas. So that went on for several years.
You described a fire at County Stadium. Can you talk more about that?
No, the fire was in Miller Park, and that was in the kettle corn machine. That's all I know about it, just the odor of it. But that was after the Milwaukee Braves.
Going on to the World Series in 1957, do you think the Milwaukee Braves deserved to win the World Series against the New York Yankees? And what are your thoughts on the series?
Well, the Yankees were a very good team, and they were in the World Series almost every year. So growing up, I thought the World Series was an annual game between the Yankees and some team from the National League. every year it was the Yankees. But the Braves had a really good team in 1957. They were strong at every position. They had filled in their last weakness when they got a good second baseman, Red Schoendienst. And yeah, they definitely deserved to win. They were a really good team. They had good pitching. Lou Burdette had a great series, won 3 games. So yeah, they deserved it.
Can you describe how the city of Milwaukee felt about it?
The city of Milwaukee, from the time that the Braves arrived on April 8th, 1953, until at least into 58 or 59, the city was crazy about the Braves. They just couldn't get enough of it. The Braves games were broadcast rather on the radio. They were on 2 different stations simultaneously. I mean, there's no sense behind that, but they were everywhere. The players were like gods, and if they would walk down the street, people would be very respectful, but they'd look at them and stare at them like there was something weird about them. The city in the 50s was booming in terms of the economy, and every company wanted to make some connection with the Braves in their advertising. Miller High Life Beer was one of the big sponsors, Clark Gasoline. Everybody wanted to make a connection with them. The Johnston Cookie Company, which is still in business, but it's called Masterson now, out beyond the right center field fence, way beyond, on National. You could see their big sign, and they built it into their advertising. They were backers of the Braves. The companies couldn't do enough for the Braves. They'd give them free dry cleaning and free gasoline for their cars. When the Braves came here in '53, of course they only moved, I mean, right before the season. Most of them had homes somewhere else, and they had nowhere to live in Milwaukee. So a lot of them lived at the Wisconsin Hotel, which is on 3rd just north of Wisconsin. And so they lived there, they rented rooms there, and they had a room set aside just for the beer that they were given by the breweries. All the breweries were doing well financially, and they wanted to give all this beer to the ball players. And I mean, they were some pretty big drinkers, but they couldn't keep up with it. It came in so fast, so they had a separate room for it. Every store wanted some connection. There was a jeweler that gave them watches. There were every possible business opportunity was taken by the Milwaukee businessmen. So it was just an exciting time, and everybody in town felt this connection to the Braves, similar to what we have with the Packers now. That's the closest analogy I can make.
Can you describe how the Milwaukeeans felt after the last game of the World Series and the celebrations that followed?
Well, as you can imagine, they were euphoric. There are quite a few pictures that you can find. In fact, I might have one that I'll show you later, of the celebration on Wisconsin Avenue. So largely Marquette University students, they all poured out of their classrooms and onto the street, and people just went crazy. They made signs praising the team, and they marched and they danced, and it was very exciting. When the team returned from New York after winning the series, the final game was in New York, there was a huge crowd waiting for them, and they were all set to line up along the parade route and watch their heroes return. As it turned out, they went a different way so they could avoid the crowd. They just wanted to get home, but the people stayed and celebrated for a good part of the evening. So it was very exciting.
Where were you when they won the World Series, and how did you react?
I'm sure I was jumping around and celebrating. I was at home. I was watching the game on TV, Game 7. I attended school in South Milwaukee. That's where I grew up. And the school system knew they had to do something when the World Series was going on. Now, a couple of the games in Milwaukee were on the weekend, so it wasn't a problem. But Game 5, for example, was on a Monday, and it started at 11 o'clock in the morning, Milwaukee time. No, I got that wrong. That's the 6th game. The 5th game was in Milwaukee, and it started at 1. So what they did was they started school a little bit earlier in the morning. Instead of 8, it was probably 7, something like that, so that people could go home and watch the games on TV. They knew they couldn't possibly compete with the World Series. So everything was built around the Braves at that time.
So the people of Milwaukee were very, very ecstatic to have the team here. Can you talk a little bit about how the city reacted when the Braves left Milwaukee?
It was like losing a member of the family. It was there was a lot of anger, hostility. I attended one game in '65, and I only went because Warren Spahn was pitching against the Braves for the Mets. But people stayed away. The first rumor of the Braves leaving town came at the All-Star break in 1963. And when I first read that, I didn't believe it. It was unimaginable that this team that Milwaukee had given itself to would leave. It didn't even seem possible. So as the rumors grew stronger and as the evidence mounted that they were clearly leaving, people were very hostile. There were problems with the county board, which controlled the ballpark, and Braves tried to leave after 1964, and they would have, except they had a lease on County Stadium that ran through 1965. So for that reason, they had to stay. But even though they stayed, people largely stayed away. The attendance was 555,000 for the year, which was less than a fourth of what it had been in their heyday. And it was just, it was a very bitter, angry time. And it was climaxed by lawsuits trying to keep the Braves here. And of course, they all failed in the end.
How did you personally react? Do you remember where you were when you first heard the confirmation that they were leaving?
Well, as I said, it kind of developed gradually. There was rumors would get stronger and stronger, and by mid-1964, it was clear that they were leaving, and you could tell that because they denied it every day, and they were just not good liars. So the general manager said, "We'll be here today, tomorrow, and as long as we're welcome." Well, everybody knew that was a lie, but anyway, there was nothing that people could do. They tried through the courts, and so I personally was very upset. I mean, there was no one particular moment, because as I said, I'd read this in the papers, and one rumor and then another rumor and so forth. But I have to say I was pretty upset, and I basically stopped following baseball for 20 years. That's how I took it. I was not a good loser.
Did the owner of the Braves get any backlash when the Braves relocated?
Well, the owner sold it in November of 1962, and he was an out-of-town owner. He didn't even come to Milwaukee very often, so it was not any surprise that he would sell the team. But the hope was that someone from Milwaukee would buy the team and keep them here. but that didn't happen. He sold it to a group of mostly lawyers and businessmen from Chicago. There were about 6 or 7 of them. And the newspapers started calling them the Rover Boys. And they took the team and they sold stock in it, so people had the opportunity to buy a small amount of the team. And the only one that really bought very much was Bud Selig. And through this whole process, Bud Selig became prominent in baseball. And, but he was involved with a group that was trying to bring baseball back after the Braves had left. The owner that brought the team here from Boston was Lou Perini. And Perini was, of course, very well received when he moved the team here. But gradually people kind of got tired of him. And when he sold the team to Chicago people, it looked like a bad sign. So, and it was a bad sign.
You mentioned earlier that you had gone to the last game that was played in Milwaukee at County Stadium.
Well, no, I didn't. The last game I attended was May 20th, 1965. The last game that was played in Milwaukee was September 22nd. So I didn't go to that. I was in college, I was out of town, and I didn't come back for it. The game in May, I was out of town for college too, but I came back along with a group of friends, and we wanted to see Warren Spahn pitch one more time. And he pitched against his old team. He started out with 3 shutout innings, and then he got bombarded, including a home run by his old friend Eddie Matthews with the bases loaded. So that was the end of that.
For that home run by Eddie Matthews, how did you react to it being a Warren Spahn fan?
Well, I was a fan of both of those guys. I was glad to see it. I like to see Matthews do well all the time. And Spahn, well, I mean, he had enough wins. He won 363 times in his career, so he could afford to lose one.
At that last game you went to, how did you react to it, knowing that it was the last Braves game you were going to go to?
Well, I was like almost all the other fans. The attendance for that game was 19,000 and some, which would have been a small crowd in the Braves' heyday. But at that time, that was their second biggest crowd of the year. The biggest was opening day, and that was only because Bud Selig's group bought all the tickets for the stadium and sold them separately as a fundraiser to get money to try and bring another team in. So at that game that I went to, and as I understand, the whole season was the same. Whenever the manager, Bobby Bragan, would come out of the dugout, people would just boo him vociferously because he was the on-field face of the ownership. And he also made some comments about Milwaukee that were not very nice. So people would just boo him, and I'm sure I was one of those.
How many games did you attend per season?
Probably about a dozen on average.
And then can you just describe like what it was like at those games and going multiple times and seeing your favorite players?
Well, I was very much a fan, and I was really into the minutia of the team, the batting averages. I mentioned that the first game I attended, I was 7 years old. By the time I was 8 years old, I knew every statistic related to the Braves. I probably knew the lineup of every team in the National League because I listened to the games on the radio. Everybody did. I mentioned that the games were on 2 radio stations simultaneously, and everybody in town had their radio on listening to the game. On a summer night, if you walked down a street in Milwaukee, somebody in the neighborhood would have the game on the radio, and you could listen to it, and then you walk farther, and the next person would have it on. It was everywhere. It was on in the stores, instead of having that Muzak that they have in the stores, they had the ball games on. So it was, well, like I said, I was a part of that, and I followed them carefully in the newspapers and on the radio and knew all the batting averages. I could tell you that Henry Aaron hit .280 when he was a rookie, 13 home runs, and that's. And I wasn't the only geek like that. I mean, there was a whole town full of them.
So you mentioned the popularity of the Braves, especially when they first came to the city, and you mentioned the comments that the owner made about Milwaukee, how they weren't the greatest. Can you first, do you remember what the comments were, and then do you think that directly led to the Braves leaving Milwaukee?
Well, they were already going. There was nothing that was going to stop it. By the start of the '64 season, everything was in place, and they were definitely going no matter what. They had a big opportunity to make money by moving to Atlanta, because there were no pro sports basically in that southeast quarter of the country. Football and baseball and basketball, hockey, those hadn't expanded to the south at all. So Atlanta was a booming city, and they had a very aggressive mayor and a committee of people headed by the president of Coca-Cola Company. They were willing to spend whatever money it took to get the team down there. And they did very well financially for a while. Their attendance really couldn't match the Braves' attendance in the old days, but anyway, the whole idea, when you saw the manager come out of the dugout, everybody would boo. So he would make comments after the game and interviews and so forth that were just not very, very nice. And especially after it was decided that the team was definitely moving, he made negative comments. Like one thing he said was he'd rather be on a last place team in Atlanta than a first place team in Milwaukee. And he also said that Milwaukee was a short beer town. That's the ultimate insult. You know, we were proud of our breweries, and people were proud of their drinking, and it was a part of the Milwaukee culture. So to insult that was probably the last straw. So people were glad to see him go. They missed their team, but they were glad to see Bobby Bragan leave.
How did you react to the insults? Did you take them personally?
No, I didn't. It wasn't aimed at me. No.
Did you ever get to interview the owner, or to sit down and talk to him?
No. I did meet the guy who was the chairman of the board of the Atlanta Braves, the one mainly responsible for that group. I met him many years later at County Stadium. He was a very nice guy.
Can you describe what it was like when Milwaukee got a baseball team again with the Milwaukee Brewers?
Well, it was a welcome thing, but it was not the same. And the way I looked at it, it was almost like a minor league team. They lost opening day 12-0. And that was just the beginning. They were not a good team at all. They had a bunch of misfits and cast-offs for players. They were not an attractive team to me, but it wouldn't have mattered. I was very upset about the Braves, and a lot of people in the city were the same way. So whoever they brought here would not meet the standards of the Braves. Attendance was, well, they didn't even get 1 million people in some of those years. So it was good that Milwaukee got a team, but I personally wasn't interested.
Can Can you describe your first time at Miller Park watching the new ball team?
Well, I mentioned some of that. We sat in the left field bleachers, and the Braves won the first game 4-0. Oh, there was one other strange thing that happened that day. The second game of the doubleheader, the Braves were losing 5-2, and they ended the game after 8 innings because of darkness. Well, there were two things that were strange there. One was it wasn't dark, and the other was they had lights in the stadium, but they didn't turn them on. So that didn't make any sense to me. I was with my dad, and I asked him what was going on. He had no idea. And I didn't find out until years later, actually, that it was because of the blue laws. I'm sure you never heard of the blue laws. This goes back to the Puritan founding of our country, and you were not supposed to do certain things on Sunday. The Sabbath was separate, and it was a day of rest, and they didn't favor baseball. There were a number of cities that couldn't play baseball on Sundays until the 1930s. And even in 1953, there still was it wasn't a law, but it was a league rule that you could not start a Sunday game after a certain time, and you couldn't put the lights on until, well, that finally changed the following year, 1954. So that was a weird ending, but other than that, I remember being really impressed with the size of the stadium, the volume of the people screaming, and it's exciting when you're 7 years old.
And then, can you describe your first time at Miller Park watching the Brewers?
Well, let's see. The first time I was in the press box, I had a press credential for that game. I was going to write about it for a publication called Chop Talk. It was the magazine of the Atlanta Braves. And I mean, your attitude when you're an adult is very different from when you're a kid. So, I mean, it wasn't exciting in the same way. It was nice to see the ballpark. It was nice to see the eagle fly in from the outfield and land on somebody's arm and all that. President Bush threw out the first ball. I remember that. Other than that, I don't remember that much about it.
Did the Brewers ever end up meeting the standards that the Braves did?
No, never will. It wouldn't be possible. It's like, well, the Braves were just the Cinderella team. They were new and exciting in a brand new ballpark, and as I've been describing, the city went crazy over them. There'll never be another professional team with that same response. People are much more, I don't know how to describe them. People are not easily impressed with things today. We're much more sophisticated, or think we are. But in those days, people were happy to be unsophisticated and just yell like crazy over their baseball team. So the day they arrived, April 8th, 1953, they had a parade that started at the train station, took them to the Schrader Hotel. They went in there on the 6th floor. There was a giant Christmas tree covered with, what do they say, 400 gifts. And every player got like 10 gifts, shaving kits and pen and pencil sets and so forth. And that was the start of the city just trying to do everything they could for the players. You would never see that today. It just isn't the same.
Can you compare the atmospheres of Miller Park and County Stadium and how how you felt at the games at the different stadiums?
Well, I liked County Stadium, but largely because it was my first major league ballpark that I ever saw. It actually was a fairly plain kind of stadium, but at the time it seemed terrific. Miller Park, I was not in favor of the new park. Bud Selig said it was essential to keep the team here and so forth, and of course he was right. When I go to a game now, and it's April or May, it's a night game, the wind is off the lake, it's like it is right now outside. You can't imagine playing baseball in that. Now they got that nice dome and it's comfortable. So I think everybody has just got a different level of expectations when we go to an event. The Bradley Center, I mean, it's 20 years old and it's obsolete. So they tear it down. That's unbelievable. But it doesn't meet the standards that we have now. If you've seen the construction of the arena, it looks pretty impressive, and I'm sure it will be. That's just what we expect now.
What do you think of the architecture of Miller Park?
I think it's amazing that they can have a roof that size that they can move. I'm very impressed with the architecture. It's a nice park. It's attractive. It has wide concourses so people can move about easily. A lot of concessions. It's very nice. I think the Brewers are doing a really good job. But it can never match the Braves.
You mentioned earlier for your first game at Miller Park that you were writing an article. Who was the article for, and how did you get involved writing articles of baseball games?
Well, that one was for Chop Talk. The name came from the Atlanta Braves doing this tomahawk chop thing, which they got from Deion Sanders, I think, from his college at Florida State. Anyway, that was the chop, and so it was supposed to be a clever name. Instead of Shop Talk, it was Chop Talk. And I had gotten to know the editor of that publication because he had reviewed my Milwaukee Braves book. So that's how he knew of me. And he called and asked if I'd be interested in writing something for the publication. So I did. That was the first time I ever had press credentials. So I could go down on the field before the game and hang around the batting cage and talk to Bob Uecker, some of the other people down there, Don Sutton. So it was fun. Just I was there for 3 days, a 3-game series. Afterwards, go to the clubhouse and interview people. Mostly I just stayed out of the way because there were people there working for a living, and I didn't want to mess with that, but that was exciting. So that's how I first started writing about the articles about the Braves.
Can you describe that a little more, going down and talking with the players one-on-one and being...
Well, I talked to Ozzie Guillen. It was a Friday, and it was the Friday before Memorial Day. And this was, this was at County Stadium. I'm thinking, it was at County Stadium. This is after the Braves and the Brewers first played for the first time, because the Brewers went to the National League. And anyway, Ozzie Guillen took his swings and came out of there, and I happened to be standing nearby, and he just looked at me and he said, does it ever get warm around here? Again, it was cold. That's how County Stadium was. Memorial Day weekend and you're freezing. So I said, yeah, it does, about July 4th. And that was it. That was my conversation with Ozzie Guillen.
Can you describe some of the interviews you have with players?
Boy, I don't know what I can tell you about them. I just ask them questions like you're doing, and I have some idea in advance what I want to ask them, what I want to know, Sometimes I know the answer, but I want them to say it. So I give them leading questions. And I usually tape record them to get the accurate quotes. And then transcribe the tape and then write the article.
Could you describe how you got involved with the Milwaukee Brave Historical Association and the Wisconsin Old Time Ball Players Association?
The Wisconsin Old Time Ball Players Association has been around since 1932. And I first started going to their events probably in the late 80s or early 90s. So I'm basically a latecomer. There are a lot of people that have been in that a long time. It's an organization that has always honored, well, mainly sandlot players. It was when it was established, it was to honor people who played amateur baseball or semi-pro. So there used to be a lot of baseball leagues in Milwaukee. That's also changed. And so people who played on those teams were in many cases very good athletes, and they would get sometimes decent crowds. So anyway, to honor that group, they formed this organization. And I just went there, they had a couple events a year, and you can get half-price tickets through them. You get these little checks that you exchange for a ticket to see a Brewer game. So I started going to those in the 90s. The Milwaukee Braves Historical Association was founded in 2000 by Johnny Logan. Johnny Logan was, as the story goes, he was watching the demolition of County Stadium. And as he saw the cranes knocking it down section by section, he felt bad about it, and he was afraid that people would forget about the Milwaukee Braves. So he wanted to have an organization, first of all, that would keep the memory alive, and also to raise enough money to build a monument outside Miller Park that would show that this team had once been here. So if you go there now, you can see it. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a monument there that lists the names of all the players who ever played for the Milwaukee Braves, plus the managers. And it's a nice monument. So that was founded in 2000. And I read about it in the newspaper. It cost $25 to join. I had no idea what they were going to do. So I sent in my $25 and waited. And I went to the first dinner that they had. They have banquets annually, sometime used to be twice a year. And so I was one of those, and I was just one of hundreds of people. I had no part in founding it or being an officer or anything. And after a couple years, they asked me, well, they wanted a couple things. One, they wanted photographs of the Braves, many of which I had from doing the book. And they wanted me to write some articles, write an article in their newsletter every once in a while. So that's how I got involved. And gradually I became more active. And so now I'm the editor of the newsletter, and I'm president of the organization. So that's where we are.
You mentioned the pictures that you have. How did you come across those pictures?
Many of them, 122 of them, I bought from the Journal, now called the Journal Sentinel. And that was in 1980, well, early 88. And I went down and went through their files. They let me look through the files of their old pictures. And I bought a one-time use of them. I bought 122 pictures. They wanted $50 a piece. And I was financing this myself. And so that was a lot of money. And I wasn't going to pay that. So we eventually negotiated a deal where if I bought more than 25, they'd drop the price $5. If I bought more than 50, they'd drop it. Well, anyway, I bought 122 of them for $15 a piece. So that was what I used in my Milwaukee Braves book. And since then, I've just accumulated them from different sources. People that had them in collections, and a lot of stuff you can get off the internet. When I wrote the book, there was no internet. It's hard to imagine no internet, but it was very primitive then. It would have saved me countless hours. But that's how I got them.
And then you had mentioned your involvement with the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association and how you became president.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe, once you joined the organization, how you worked your way up to become president?
Well, I didn't work my way up. I was kind of sucked into it. But initially I was asked to donate a few pictures. And I did. And then I was asked, I had written the book about the Braves, and they knew that. So they asked me to write articles. And if you stay in an organization long enough, you end up getting more responsibility. So that's what happened. And I became the president because nobody wanted it.
So going back to the pictures, you mentioned collecting all the pictures. What kind of other memorabilia do you collect?
Not much. I've never been a collector. The photos I use in various publications, and I do PowerPoint presentations about the Braves or about my new book about Borchard Field. So, those have some use to me. Other than that, they just sit in a drawer somewhere. I don't collect them. I know some collectors, so if I need certain things, I can borrow them from them. There's a guy in Illinois who is one of the active people in the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association who owns, he estimates, of about 100,000 pieces of Milwaukee Braves memorabilia. I've never been to his house. I'm going to have to go soon, but he just has an amazing collection. So he's got the turnstile from County Stadium, from one of the gates. He's got everything you can think of. Home plate from the '57 World Series, contracts that these guys signed, just everything, amazing stuff. But I'm not at that level at all. I've accumulated a few things. That's about it.
You mentioned using the pictures for PowerPoint presentations. What do you use the PowerPoint presentations for?
Well, I speak to different groups. If they ask me to talk about them, I will. So, let's see, most recently, 2 nights ago, I did a presentation. This is in conjunction with the showing of a film of the 1957 World Series, Game 4. So that was shown. There were 50 people or something. I'm going to give a talk next Wednesday to Historic Milwaukee Incorporated. Just that sort of thing, different groups.
What other clubs or baseball organizations have you been involved in? Like any local organizations?
Well, just the 2 that we've been talking about. There's one other one called the World Series Club. The World Series Club started when the Braves were here. I didn't have anything to do with it until about, 8 or 10 years ago. But when it was founded in the 50s, it was a way to encourage people to become season ticket holders of the Braves. So if you were a member of this group, you would have a luncheon. I don't know if they had a monthly or what. This is all before my time. But they would have some of the ball players there. So you get to meet ball players and get their autograph and so forth. The ball players used to be very accessible, not to me as a kid, but out in the community. For example, right now, if you think of somebody from the Brewers, say Ryan Braun. Okay, you all know who Ryan Braun is. But you think you'll ever see him on the street or in a restaurant? You never see these people. They live at a different level of society, just like millionaires and movie stars and whatever. But in the 50s, they were very visible. First of all, they weren't making a whole lot of money in comparison. Warren Spahn in 1953 was the highest paid Brave. He was making $25,000 a year. Well, that doesn't sound like much. And even adjusting for inflation, it's probably below the minimum wage for the major leagues, which is $507,000. So anybody that can wobble out onto the field is guaranteed $500,000. Well, they're at a different level of society, so you don't see them. I'll show you, when I show you the photos, there's a photocopy of an article that was in the Milwaukee paper at the time of the '57 World Series. And the reason I brought it is to show you that it's a picture of the World Series star Lou Burdett and his wife, and they had just had a child. And it gives their home address. This was common in the 50s. Everybody's home address was in the newspaper. Imagine that with Ryan Braun. You know, he lives at 414 North Prospect. Well, you'd have people there and it'd be insane. But that's the way they did it in the 50s. Spahn and Burdett and their families shared a duplex over on north of Washington Drive. So they were very visible. If there were any group having some kind of banquet, let's say a sports banquet from Marquette High School, well, they would have 2 or 3 members of the Braves there, maybe more than that. And Eddie Matthews, who was a future Hall of Famer, might be there. And they didn't get paid for it. That was just like part of their job. So players were treated differently back then.
We talked earlier about how you got involved in writing your first book. Can you describe the beginning of your second book and how you got involved in writing the second book?
The first book, Milwaukee Braves, A Baseball Eulogy, has a banner on the cover. I think you saw it. And it says, "Forward by Eddie Matthews." So I wanted that just to put his name on the cover to give the book some kind of credibility. Well, he was a logical person to write about. I wanted to write a biography of one of the players. Preferably, well, Matthews was the first choice, Spahn was second. Spahn would have been very difficult. He was a different kind of guy. I didn't know if there was a chance that Matthews would do it or not. But I had done that first book, and his name was on the cover, for which I paid him some money. And I didn't know if he'd do it otherwise or not. He might have. But I needed his permission anyway. So when I wanted to write the biography, I contacted him at a card show. They used to have baseball card shows all the time, and that's kind of died out now, but he would be there signing autographs, and he was at State Fair Park, and I stood in a line and paid my $2, whatever it was, to get an autograph, which I didn't want anyway, and I got up to the front, and I said, "Have you considered," well, first of all, we talked a little about the book, because I had given him a couple boxes of the books, and he gave them to friends and so forth, and he seemed real happy with it. So I said, "Would you be interested in doing a book about your life?" And he laughed and he said, "No, the world isn't ready for that." I said, "Well, if you ever change your mind, let me know." Well, of course he didn't. So it was, what year would it have been? In the 90s, 1992. It was about Easter time. And I happened to be in northern Wisconsin on vacation. And it occurred to me that he wasn't going to live forever. He didn't take good care of himself. He smoked and drank and so forth. So I said I thought I'd take one more chance at getting him to do a book with me. So I wrote him a letter, and I gave him 3 reasons why he should write the book. One was for his grandchildren, one was for something else, just to, to talk about his place in baseball history. I don't know what the other one was. But I said, if you don't want to do it, just throw this letter away. I'll never contact you again. And if you're interested, give me a call. Call collect. That was before people had phones and everything was, free. But so anyway, he called. His wife called about a week later. And she put him on the phone, and he said, let's do it. Those were his first 3 words. And so we did. So I was teaching at the time, and when school ended, I flew out to San Diego and spent 3 days just talking to him, tape recording it. I had about 20 hours of tape, which I had to transcribe, which is a horrible job. And I made it into a book. So that's where that came from.
You mentioned that you would have liked to do a book on Warren Spahn, but he was a different type of player. What do you mean by that?
I don't think he would have been cooperative. If I said I'd like to write a book about you, he'd say no. That'd be the end of it. I met him a number of times, and he was just a more difficult person. I thought he was kind of moody, and he was a very private person. I mean, I don't want to badmouth him. He was a nice enough person, but he was private. There was a guy in I believe it was 60, maybe a little earlier, who wrote a biography about Spahn and didn't get his permission, didn't interview him, didn't talk to him at all, but just took his information from various printed sources. And Spahn sued him for $10,000. And it went through the courts, and in the end, he didn't win, but the book was effectively blocked. And it was just because he was very private. And it was not a negative book at all. It was about his role in World War II. He had been a soldier in World War II. He was injured and got some kind of Bronze Star, some kind of medal. It wasn't the Bronze Star, but he sued because even though the book said nothing but good things about him, he said they weren't true, and they exaggerated his role. He was embarrassed that people who were in the army with him would think he was talking about how great he was as a soldier. So anyway, that I think would have prevented me from writing a book about him.
How difficult is it when you write the books about the Braves to fact check and make sure you have everything correct?
Well, there are a lot of newspapers and magazines out there, and the internet now, there's a ton of stuff. There are certain sites that I use all the time. Retrosheet.org. I don't know how the world got by before that was around. And that's only been around for 10 years, maybe? I don't know. But we take all the technology for granted, and when I did the books, none of that was around. But it'll give you a play-by-play account of every game in the major leagues. Not everyone, it's not complete, but almost everyone. So if I want to know how Spahn did on May 20th, 1965, a couple of clicks of the mouse and there's the whole game. First batter popped out to the shortstop. Second batter did, and you got all of that. So it's just amazing what's out there. So you can fact check it through stuff like that.
I think we'd like to take a little break now. Is
Okay.
that okay with you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What was the most memorable game that you attended for the Milwaukee Braves?
You just want the Braves and not the Brewers?
Or both or either?
The most amazing thing I saw in County Stadium was the 4th of July 1974. Carl Wallenda walked a wire across above the stadium from the ends of the upper deck. That to me was the greatest. It has nothing to do with baseball, and it's not the Braves, but the Braves, well, I attended a couple of the World Series games in 57 and 58, so those are memorable. I would say maybe the most memorable, maybe because I was a little younger and it meant more, but the 1955 All-Star game, which was played in Milwaukee. So I always thought the All-Star game was a big deal. For a long time it was, and then it stopped being that. But in 55 it was a big deal. The leagues really wanted to win. And the Braves had several of their players in the lineup. That day Eddie Matthews was injured. There was a line shot that he did something to his wrist or his finger or something. And they took him out and took him to the hospital. That was exciting. It was the only time I saw Ted Williams in person. He almost hit a 3-run homer, but Willie Mays caught it, reached above the fence and caught it. So that was exciting. And then Gene Conley, the local favorite, came in the 12th inning and he struck out all 3 guys he faced. And the bottom of the inning, Stan Musial hit a home run to win the game for the National League. So that was a big deal in those days. I was 9 years old and couldn't get any more exciting than that. Other than that, I mean, there's so many games that they kind of all get bunched together. I remember the opening doubleheader, the first time I was there. That's memorable. I saw the Aaron brothers hit home runs in the same inning, in 62. So Henry's younger brother, Tommy, played for the Braves also for a couple of years. Wasn't nearly as good as Henry, but that was an interesting game. Other than that, I don't know, nothing in particular.
You discussed attending the World Series games in 97, 98.
57 and 58.
Yeah, my bad.
Right.
Can you talk about attending those games, in particular the Game 4 of 1957?
Well, the Yankees were leading the series 2-1, and I attended the 4th game, which was played on a Sunday, and my dad and I were seated in the left field bleachers. Warren Spahn was pitching. He pitched a great game. He was winning 4-1 in the 9th inning. The Yankees, with 2 outs, got a single. Then they got another single. And then Elston Howard hit a 3-run homer. The homer hit at this point, my dad and I were going to try and beat part of the crowd. So we weren't going to leave early, but we wanted to get to a place where we could get out quickly. So we came down from the bleachers and stood at ground level, just beyond the fence. And there were quite a few other people down there. And we were all set to make a dash for it, and then Elston Howard hit his home run. It tied the game, so we went back to our seats, watched from there. But they came from behind. In the 10th inning, the Yankees scored another run. They took a lead of 5-4. So in the bottom, Spahn was still in the game, by the way, pitched a complete game. He usually did. In the bottom of the 10th, the first batter that was due up was Warren Spahn. He was a good hitter for a pitcher, but still a pitcher. So they put in a pinch hitter for him, Nippy Jones. Nippy was obviously not his real name, but his real name was Vernal, like the vernal equinox. So I guess when your name is Vernal, you get a nickname. So they called him Nippy. And Nippy Jones batted, and the first pitch looked like it hit him in the foot. He jumped out of the way, but it looked like he had gotten it on the foot. And he immediately pointed to his foot, saying, "It hit me." so he'd get first base. The umpire went like this, no, it didn't hit you. So Jones retrieved the ball, and he showed it to the umpire, and on the ball was a smudge of shoe polish. So they had, the clubhouse attendant had polished all the shoes so they looked nice for the World Series. So that was the evidence, the smudge of shoe polish. So he went to first base. Then Felix Mantilla went in as a pinch runner. And Johnny Logan hit a double to tie the game. And then Eddie Matthews came up, and everybody in Milwaukee was holding their breath. This was really exciting. If they lost this game, they'd be down 3-1 and probably lose the series. So Matthews came up and worked the count. I think he got to a full count. He fouled off several pitches, and then he hit a home run. So people went crazy, and I went crazy. My dad and I rushed for the car, but it was very exciting. So the 58 series, the highlight, I guess there's a pun there, is what I mentioned about the 60-year-old man from Brooklyn climbing the light standard. So he's up 122 feet and swaying in the breeze. Had to be freezing. It was in October. And he got cold about the 6th inning, and he tried to yell to get somebody's attention because he couldn't get down. I don't know how he got up there, but he did, and he was afraid to come down. So he finally found something that he could drop, and he got somebody's attention down below in the bullpen. And so they got a fire engine. The ladder wouldn't reach to the top, but they sent a firefighter up the ladder as far as it would go, and then he climbed the rest of the way. And they tied a rope around Anthony Albano, and they lowered him and saved him. I was at the game. We could see that there was a fire engine. We had no idea what they were doing. Where I was, I couldn't see the guy being lowered. So I didn't know until the next day in the newspaper. They had a series of photos. So that was 1958 World Series. One of the disappointing ones was the 1959 World Series because the Braves weren't in it. But they should have been. They had maybe their best team ever. Matthews led the league in home runs. Aaron hit 355, which was his highest ever. They had good pitching, 2 20-game winners. Everything pointed to a victory, but they struggled all year. Tied for the pennant, and then in a playoff, they lost 2 games straight to the Dodgers. The first one was in Milwaukee. It was a drizzly, cold, miserable day, but there weren't even 20,000 people there. That was a disappointment, and it should have been the first clue that maybe things were changing. Attitude toward the Braves was not what it had been. Because in '53, people would have stood there in a hurricane to watch, but things were changing. So that's about it for the World Series memories.
Looking back at the Game 4, did you read anything about why the man climbed the pole?
The man wanted to draw attention because one of his children, he had 10 children, and one of them needed eye surgery. So he was hoping to attract attention. I guess he thought people would feel sorry for him and send him money. I don't know.
What is the most historically significant game that you attended?
Well, this again, if you go to the the Brewers era, I was at the 300th win of Nolan Ryan. But as far as historic for the Braves, I didn't attend that many historic games. I've mentioned the World Series games, the All-Star game. That's about it. That's all that comes to mind. It was really what I would consider historic. There were a lot of interesting games, a lot of interesting players, and good performances. But nothing else comes to mind.
And then what was your favorite memory at a Braves game?
Favorite what?
Favorite memory at a Braves game?
Well, I guess it would be that All-Star game. It was very dramatic. Some really great players in that game. I mentioned Ted Williams, Willie Mays, great players, Henry Aaron, and yeah, that was probably the most historic, most interesting individual game.
And then finally, is there any other stories or anecdotes you have about the Milwaukee Braves that you'd like to tell at this time?
Oh boy. Well, Eddie Matthews, as I said, my favorite player, always seemed to be in the middle of things. He was the enforcer on the team. If the opposing team did something threatening, he was there to handle it. He was like the bouncer. And there were many times when Johnny Logan, who batted right ahead of him in the order, Logan would start a fight and Matthews would finish it. So Matthews had a whole bunch of pretty well-known fights. And he was the National League heavyweight champion. He'd take on anybody. He used to tell pitchers, throw inside on them. Don't be afraid to throw inside. If they come out toward the mound, they'll never make it. And he would move in, and he meant it. So there were a number of famous fights that he had. One of the most famous took place in Ebbets Field, but there are photos of it. And Logan was batting against Don Drysdale. Drysdale was a big, tall, sidearm pitcher, and everybody hated to face him because he was wild and they were afraid they'd get killed. And in this particular game, Logan was hit with a pitch, hit him right in the ribs. So as Logan is going down to first base, he started yelling things at Drysdale. And Drysdale, of course, he's not going to back down. He said, come on, why don't you come out here? So Logan did. He charged the mound, and before he even got there, Eddie Matthews was out there, and there was a series of pictures of him in the paper the next day showing the punch that he threw. So it starts here, then there's one here, and then there's one here, and there's Drysdale on the ground. Matthews then jumped on top of him and kept pounding him. And after the game, they interviewed Matthews, of course, and he said, fight? What fight? There was no fight. So he didn't consider that a fight. That was just part of baseball. And he was always there for his teammates. He had a fight with Frank Robinson. Robinson slid hard into third, and he spiked Matthews. And the way Eddie told me the story, he said something like, Frank, don't go doing that. Well, I can't believe those were his exact words. I think it might have been something a little stronger than that. But he said something to Robinson, and Robinson responded. Now, what he said, I don't know. But Matthews immediately was on top of him and just pounding his head. And that was the first game of a doubleheader. Matthews was ejected from the game for doing that. And I don't think Robinson was. So that was just the kind of player that Eddie was, a very competitive guy. He said the way he judged himself was he wanted in every game to do better than the third baseman on the other team, because he was a third baseman. And that's the way he looked at it. And he had a great career. He had 512 home runs. He's in the Hall of Fame. And if you talk to anybody who their favorite players were, or maybe the favorite player in the 50s, they'll tell you Eddie Matthews. People have told me that so many times. Oh, I love Eddie. And they did.
With Eddie being as skilled as he was as a hitter and a baseball player, did it concern you at all whenever he would start a brawl that he might get injured or something?
No, not at all. He was so tough. He could handle himself. Yeah, he was the heavyweight champ.
That's all we have for you today. Thank you for.
Do you want to ask about Orchard Field in the book? Just writing about that.
Oh yeah, sure. So lastly, you're working on a new book about Borchardt Field. Can you tell us?
Actually, it's already been published.
Can you tell us a little bit about the new publication?
Oh, I can tell you a lot about it. How many would you like to buy, first of all? Borchardt Field was Milwaukee's ballpark before County Stadium. When it was built, the United States had 38 states, so pretty old. At the time it was built, the White House didn't have electricity yet. So we're talking about way back in history. And it was a great place. I never saw it, unfortunately. It was torn down in 61. No, what am I talking about? Torn down in 53. I've seen many pictures, and I've researched it for a long time. I spent 9 years on the research. And so it tells the story of this park and the amazing players that played there and some of the incredible things they did there. So a lot of players played there a few times, like Babe Ruth, for example. Everybody knows Babe Ruth. He played there 3 times, exhibition games. They had what they called barnstorming. They'd get a bunch of major leaguers and they'd travel around the country for a month after the season ended. And they'd play against whatever team wanted to play them. And of course people wanted to see Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig or all those guys. So they would go to these games. And that's pretty much what the book is about. There are things besides baseball. There's football. Newt Rockne coached there when he was coaching Notre Dame against Marquette University. The 1922 balloon race took off from inside Borchardt Field. I can tell you all about the balloon race. You want to hear the balloon race? All right. The way the balloon race worked, these would be 5-story high gigantic balloons, like you'd see a hot air balloon. These are filled with coal gas, but it was just like filling it with oxygen. And they would take off from inside the ballpark. And there were 13 entrants, and the winner was not the one that went fastest. The time had nothing to do with it. It was distance. Whichever balloon went the furthest distance without having to land was the winner. So 13 of them took off. One of them had a leak in it, and the guy knew it, but he wanted to see how far it would go anyway. So he barely cleared the top of the grandstand, and he went about 4 miles. Landed at what is now South Shore Park, and that was it for him. The winner, well, these people went all over. You couldn't steer a balloon, obviously. The only way you could control it at all was by adding more gas or burning more gas or less, so you could change the altitude. And it would get you into a different jet stream. So the winner landed just north of Quebec City, which is almost 1,000 miles. And it did that in less than 24 hours. So you can imagine this thing really moving along. And it had to be cold. They had to carry certain things. They had to carry brochures about Milwaukee, which they could throw over the side and scatter all over, because the city of Milwaukee was sponsoring the race. They also had to have 200 feet of rope. In case they landed in the top of a tree, they had to be able to climb down. This is 22. There are no cell phones. There's no walkie-talkie, nothing, no communication. So people would be, they'd phone somebody, the city maybe, and say, I spotted the balloon over Lake Erie or whatever. Well, some of them ended up in the Lake Erie area, some of them in Missouri. They went all over. But the winner went north of Quebec. There were a lot of incredible things there. The Lone Ranger was there in 1946. The Lone Ranger was very popular on radio, and he had a great voice on the radio. But the guy with the great voice didn't look like the Lone Ranger looked. So they had to have two of them, one on the radio and one doing public appearances. So the one doing public appearances was with a rodeo that played inside Borchard Field in 1946. They had auto thrill races. The Green Bay Packers played there 10 times, 7 times as the visitors and 3 times as the home team. Milwaukee had a team in the NFL in 1922, the Badgers. They lasted 5 years. Racine had a team in the NFL. So everybody knows the NFL today, but they don't know the history. There's a lot of history behind that. And so the Packer players, of course, are pretty well known. And the people they played against, Red Grange, all the big names played in Borchard Field. So I spent 9 years researching that, and it's available at fine bookstores everywhere. Even crummy bookstores probably have it. Amazon has it. So now I do talks about Borchard Field, more than Milwaukee Braves. That's about it. Was there a question there about Aaron?
Oh yeah. Did you ever meet Hank Aaron?
I did. I actually met him several times. I have a picture. He used to do a fundraiser every year. It ended a year ago, but for years he did that to raise money for his foundation, Chasing the Dream. And whenever people would attend, the price of the meal was pretty steep. I think it was $300. So obviously really good food. But you would get something autographed by him, or one year everybody posed for a picture with him. So I do have a posed portrait of myself with Hank. And he came to several of our banquets for the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association. I met him at an Arby's on 27th Street one time. He owned the Arby's. He owned several of them. And one of them is not too far from where I live. So I went there and he signed the cover of my book. So I met him a few times. Didn't know him well or anything, but nice guy.
I believe that's all we have for you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for doing the interview.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.